नमस्कार आणि येवकार तुमकां आमची नदर आसा हे आमचे कार्यावळींत. गोंयांत घोग्यांनी पावस पडटा आनी दर वर्सा पावस पडटा आनी आमची शारां उदका पोंदा वतात. खास करून पणजे शार दर्याच्या लागीं आसा, मांडवीच्या न्हंयच्या तिरार आसा आनी हें शार दर वर्सा पावसांत उदका पोंदा वता. सगळ्याक रस्त्याचेर उदक जाता, बिल्डिंगांनी उदक येता आनी लोकांची जीण आसा ती कठीण जावन बसता. गाडयांक सारको रस्तो मेळना, लोकांक चलतल्यांक सारको रस्तो मेळना, दुकानां मार्केट सगळीं उदकान भरून वता. ह्या प्रश्नाचेर आमी आज उलयतले NIOचे रिटायर्ड चीफ सायंटिस्ट बाब रमेश कुमार हांचे वांगडा. रमेश कुमार बाब, तुमकां येवकार.
नमस्कार.
जशें हांवें सांगलें तशें दर वर्सा पावस पडटा, पणजे भरता, सगळीं आमची दुकानां घरां सगळीं उदका पोंदा वता आनी मागीर सप्टेंबर ऑक्टोबर म्हणटसर पावस सोंपता आनी लोक सगळे विसरून वतात. हो जो इशू आसा हो सारको इम्पॉर्टंट इशू, कारण ह्या पावसाक लागून उदक भरता ताका लागून फकत काम धंद्याचेर इफेक्ट जायना पण लोकांच्या आरोग्याचेरूय इफेक्ट जाता. तुमच्या मतान हें पणजेन उदक भरपाचें मेन कारण म्हळ्यार मुखेल कारण कितें?
There are two important reasons for flooding either in Goa or in Panjim in particular. One is actually natural causes are there. When there is actually so much of rainfall in a short period of time, maybe a day or maybe in a few hours. When we say few hours, it's basically because of the cloud bursts. And man-made effects are also there. For example, if a place like say Panjim, we have actually n number of drainages which are not actually properly maintained. So there is an important aspect is actually what I would call is actually civic sense is equally important. When we don't use or throw our things, whether it's actually plastic bags or plastic bottles, and dispose them off, most of the drainage systems gets choked. So the water, the excessive rainfall which falls on these areas does not go back into either the river basin or into the rivers. In good old days, we used to have so many wells in most of the houses. So there was actually a major mechanism for the excess rainfall which falls in an area to go into the wells of most of the houses, or we used to have ponds which are actually associated with most of the temples. So these mechanisms, or earlier good old days, we used to have actually a lot of paddy fields. From Panjim to Donapola, we had actually so much of paddy fields in this one. Now all of them have got exhausted. Where are the paddy fields? Where are the ponds? Where are the wells? So there is no mechanism of recharging the groundwater when the rainfall is excess.
सो तुमी म्हणलें तशें शेतां आशिल्लीं, ओके, बांयो आशिल्ल्यो, तळीं आशिल्लीं, हातूंतल्यान उदक झिरपतालें. आतां आमी वचत थंय सिमेंटाचें कन्स्ट्रक्शन केलां आनी आमी खूब कडेन रिक्लेमेशनच्या नांवार बिल्डिंगो बांदल्यात. हें रिक्लेमेशन आमकां कितले मेरेन मारक?
Exactly. I was coming to that point. In fact, now Panjim, instead of actually a smart city, has become like a concrete jungle. Because, and not only that, in addition to that, there are several things. Like say, for example, people say in a climate change scenario, there is actually more and more of actually sea level rise, which in turn can actually put river, let's say river or maybe the ocean water or the sea water to incur actually into the paddy fields, even to the cities. So that saline water incursion is actually a major important thing, especially for the paddy or the agriculture or even to the cities. So that is one important aspect, and it also affects the coastal areas. It creates, there is so much of erosion in the coastal areas which is actually equally dangerous.
से इरोजन जे बी म्हणटात तेन्ना सगळी जी माती आसा ती दर्यान व्हांवन वता आनी दर्याचो लेवल आनी जमनीचो लेवल हांचे भितर तफावत येता. हाका इमिजिएट ब्लेम कोणाक करप?
See, not only there is actually erosion, even if you look at most of our drainages, that is never desilted. Most of the rivers are also not, siltation is not taken properly. Even our dams, for example, they may not have enough, let's say, capacity to hold that much of water. So the dams are not actually silted, or neither the rivers. So there are several things which either the government has to do, and even most of us, for example, when you talk of coastal things, why we should have actually shacks and seabeds actually in the coastal areas, it's actually unimaginable. I don't realize how, because it's a human greed, not the need. We want to have actually sit in a beach and eat. Why it should be that? Why should we sit in a beach, whether it's a Kalangut beach or a Palolim beach or whichever beaches? The shacks are creating, and most of the shacks nowadays they started constructing and using concrete even, which is equally dangerous.
आता पणजे सारक्या शारांत आमी जेन्ना पणजेच्यान दोनापावल वता आमकां वाटेक करंजाले बी ह्या एरिये भितर सँड ड्युन्स दिसताल्यो. बीच टुरिजम जेन्ना आयलें, सँड ड्युन्स काबार लागल्यो. सो सँड ड्युन्साचें आमकां महत्व कितें गोंयाक?
Very important question. In fact, in Miramar Beach, in good old days when we used to go to Miramar Beach, there were lots of sand dunes. Not only sand dunes, there are so many things, our greenery, flora, fauna, all this in the, you used to have some small crabs or whatever. So the whole, this one has actually changed from bad to worse, and worse for a very difficult scenario, because unplanned development, that is what I wanted to stress. Unplanned development, just like our Professor Madhav Gadgil always used to say, he used to traverse the entire Western Ghats belts from Kerala up to Mumbai, and he said that unplanned development, and without listening to the ecological this one or the environment, this will create a problem. This is exactly what has happened. And when we say we want development, whether it's actually ecological development or environmental development, if we don't take the stakeholder also into consideration, that is a dangerous thing.
Now the city of Panjim was originally conceived by Portuguese. Okay, the way they constructed this city. In the olden times, we never heard of Panjim getting flooded. It was a phenomenon in the last few years, last 20, 30 years. And now we want to make Panjim into smart city. Don't you feel there is a discrepancy in this whole thing?
Yeah, excellent question. When you said this, actually, in good old days, Panjim was actually part of Portuguese colony till 1961. But if you remember, the population in 1961 and in the year 2022, that puts a lot of pressure. The population is, I don't know, quadrupled or whatever. That is one thing. And another thing, if you look at, most of the people, actually every household in Goa has actually 2 4-wheelers and at least 2 or 3 3-wheelers. So that puts a pressure. We need the roads, we need houses, we need buildings, we need malls, we need housing societies. So each and everything puts pressure on the environment, and especially the land use, land cover pattern. If you look at, actually, as you said, 30 or 40 years back, in fact, I joined NIO way back in 1982. In my own lifetime, if I look at, there is so much of change in the land use, land cover pattern of Goa, especially the Panjim city. You cannot identify the places where you had actually been, because everything has changed. We are huge and huge, vertically developing housing societies, or maybe, you name anything, there is no place left in Goa which is not ecologically friendly. Or in good old days, maybe if you look at the 60s and 2020 scenario, the things have changed from, I should say, bad to worse.
But लोकांचो आणि जे politicians असता आणि जे planners असता, they have a typical argument. They म्हणता कितें की development cannot be escaped. Development has to be there. Without development आमचें life सुखी जावचें ना. आतां आमचो जो डेव्हलपमेंटाचो जो प्लॅन आसा, तो प्लॅन नेचराक खंय तरी खूब हार्म करता, आनी हें आमकां लक्षांत येना काय आमी हें लक्षांत येवन सुद्दां आमी अशें चालू दवरतात.
Basically, we should have actually sustainable development. As you correctly said, development can be at any level, but if you have a sustainable development in taking into consideration, no, this is not the story for Goa alone. If you look at the whole of the coastal area, starting from Kerala, Kerala also has actually suffered. In fact, if you look at the 2018 floods in Kerala, was one devastating. There are several instances of such things in Karnataka also, and in Goa also, even in Mumbai also. So don't think that any state or any area is actually deprived of, let us say, this one. But if you have a sustained development and taking into consideration, let's say, nature in this one, then things will be much better. So let us not blame the politicians alone. The human tendency is actually to have access into the best places. We will say a riverfront flat or maybe ocean viewing flat. So such things are actually coming from the builder's point of view or from the seller's point of view. So if it can be prevented or maybe reduced or whatever, the damage to the nature can be substantially done.
Yeah, but the thing is, आमकां हाचेर आन्सर मेळटा तें म्हणजे की नेचर देर इज इम्बॅलन्स, ओके, आनी आमी कितलीय जरी काळजी घेतली तरी सुद्दां देर आर फेनोमेनन लायक तोक्ते वा सुनामी ह्यो येत रावतल्यो बिकॉज नेचरा भितर कितें तरी प्रॉब्लेम आसा. वी डोंट रियलायज दॅट ह्युमन इंटरफिरन्साक लागून तो नेचरान प्रॉब्लेम आयला. सो ही एटिट्यूड आमी कितले मेरेन अशी चालू दवरतले.
Yeah, exactly. What you see this too, because the natural disasters are always there, whether it's actually a cyclone or excess rainfall or extreme rainfall event or intense rainfall event or maybe tsunami, these are always there. But the human intervention, as you correctly mentioned, human intervention is actually human should adapt or maybe change or be a part of nature. We should not be an anomaly, or we should not show our this one towards the nature, or maybe we should not be against the nature. As you correctly mentioned, the sand dunes. By removing the sand dunes, for example, when you used to go to the roads of Miramar, most of the sand used to come from the beach actually to the roads, and then people wanted to have actually this one, so they removed the sand dunes, which is actually ridiculous. So each of the natural things have actually a way or a mechanism to protect their environment, or like say we used to say sacred groves, which Rajendra Kerkar was mentioning. So people have been doing, nature has its own way or mechanism to protect itself, but as you correctly mentioned, the human beings, because of their greed, not the need, as Mahatma Gandhi correctly said, there is enough for every man's need, but not for his greed. Because of the human greed, we try to encroach, whether it's the river basins or the important natural areas, whether it's a beach or whatever area, we try to encroach and make the life difficult for ourselves.
कित्याक दुसरी गोष्ट आसा की पणजी इज अ कोस्टल सिटी आसाच, बट मांडवीची येदी व्हडली ताका देग आसा. आतां हिंटरलँडा भितर जेन्ना मांडवीचेर इफेक्ट जाता किंवा मांडवीच्या उदकाचेर जेन्ना प्रेशर येता, कित्याक थंयचीं झाडां कापतात, थंय डिफॉरेस्टेशन जाल्लां, ताका लागूनय चडशें उदक पणजे भितर लोटता. सो हिंटरलँडा भितरलो प्रॉब्लेम कितलो आमकां इफेक्ट करता ह्या बिचाचेर.
Exactly, what you said is true. Deforestation is a very, very important thing. For example, just to construct some buildings or societies or whatever, we try to remove most of the trees. Even within the Panjim city, if you look at the past 30-40 years, several trees have been removed, and we have only a few pockets, like say Madhe wildlife or maybe a few areas. But then we say there is actually 30% forest cover, which the Department of Forests have actually correctly mentioned. But unless and until we stick on to that, and there are several areas like say mangroves, several things have been removed. People say, as you said, for development or whatever, but at the end of the day, unless it is actually kept in, let us say we are a part and parcel of the nature, this is actually going to seriously affect. And as you correctly said, Panjimis want to be smart, but I would say it is not the city should be smart, even the people, the stakeholders should be equally smart and sensible and sensitized, I should say, towards the nature and its environment.
The people who should be sensitized, people have to be aware of all these calamities. आणि आमी हाजेर उलोवया, रोल ऑफ द पब्लीक, रोल ऑफ द पीपल, पॉलिटिशियन्स, प्लॅनर्स, तांचो कितें रोल आसा, बिल्डर्सांची ग्रीड आसा, बट एट द सेम टायम सिवीक सोसायटी म्हणून आमची कितें तरी जबाबदारी आसा. आमी ह्या इश्यूचेरूय उलोवया, पूण आतां वेळ जालो एक ल्हानसो ब्रेक घेवपाची. आमी ब्रेका उपरांत परते मेळुया. तुमी खंयच सुद्दां नाकात, पळयत रावात गोमंतक टीव्ही. नमस्कार आणि परतून तुमकां येवकार. ब्रेका उपरांत आमची नदर आसा ही आमच्या कार्यावळींत. आमच्या वांगडा आसात एनआयओचे रिटायर्ड चीफ सायंटिस्ट बाब रमेश कुमार, आनी तांकां आमी जे आयज उलयतात त्या विशयाचो खूब अभ्यास आसा. आमी उलयतात पणजे सारक्या शारांत कसो हुंवार येता, कशें उदक भरता आनी लोकांचे जिणेचेर ताचो कसो परिणाम जाता. ब्रेकाक वचच्या आदीं आमी उलयताले की नॅचरल कॅलेमिटीज, डिफॉरेस्टेशन किंवा आमचो ह्युमन इंटरवेन्शन वाडिल्ल्यान ह्यो नॅचरल कॅलेमिटीज कश्यो येतात आनी कश्यो वाडटात. एक सिवीक सोसायटी म्हणूनय आमचो एक रोल आसता. आमी ब्लेम गेम सुरू करतात, एकामेकांक ब्लेम करप, पॉलिटिशनाक ब्लेम करप, एडमिनिस्ट्रेशनाक ब्लेम करप, प्लॅनरांक ब्लेम करप, पूण आमी स्वता कडेन जी 3 बोटां आसात ती केन्नाच पळयना. एज अ सिटीजन आमचो हांगा रोल कितें आनी आमी हांगा खंय चुकतात.
I would say, as a citizen, we should try to use more and more of public transport to start with. Because if each person takes actually a 4-wheeler or a 2-wheeler, that creates lot damages, especially from the greenhouse gases point of view. That is one. And even if you take actually, even forget about a 4-wheeler is impossible to park actually in Panjim. You will take some 2 or 3 rounds even to get actually parking place for 4-wheelers, and 2-wheelers is the same story. So just imagine. That's what I said. Just imagine. So we should try to use more and more of public transport to start with. And maybe we should try to use as much as possible, when we say gaunti, locally available vegetables. Instead of trying to get some, let us say, foreign things, maybe from Dubai or maybe some European countries or whatever, try to use whatever is locally available in and around Panjim, maybe from Keppem or let's say Sanglim or maybe Valpoi or whatever, in and around vegetables to start, because they also get transported from far off places. In order to bring that also, they have to spend, and traffic should be maybe, let us say, properly organized. there is and several schools. Luckily, in good old days, most of the schools were actually in Panjim. Now, a good thing which has happened is actually most of the things have actually shifted now to Kujira complex in Bambuli. I would say that's actually a positive thing. So, such a way that things are actually, let us say, widespread rather than focused on a few centers. So, whether the school system has actually moved away into the Kujira complex is an excellent decision. So that there is no, in the early morning hours, if you look at maybe 7 to 8, up to maybe 9 or whatever, so many school buses, every parent want to drop his or her child actually into the school, if preferably into the bench or the desk. That creates a chaos actually in the morning. So such things, so as a human being, or let us say as a common man, we should be aware of these things.
It is said that development of any country or any region is not measured from the number of vehicles that they have, but it is measured from how many people use the public transport. So आमकां पब्लीक ट्रान्सपोर्टाची तर संवय गेल्याच, प्रत्येका कडेन आज गाडी घोडो जाय पडटा. पूण दुसरी गजाल जाल्या ताचे बरोबर आमी पॅकेज्ड फूड, तूं म्हणटालो तशें की आमकां आमच्या हांगा व्हेजिटेबल्स ग्रो करचे पडटले, लोकल फूड ग्रो करचे पडटले. बट सद्या उदका सारके सुद्दां आमकां प्रॉब्लेम जाला, कित्याक पणजे सारक्या शारांतल्यान इतकें वॉटर हार्वेस्टींग जाता, जे झरी आसा तांचें उदक चोरून चोरून हॉटेलांक वा कासिनोक वा दुसऱ्या आस्थापनाक सप्लाय करतात. ताका लागूनय आमचेर हावळ आयिल्ली आसा आनी आमकां ह्यो बांयो आनी झरी सोडून आमकां आतां सद्या पॅकेज बाटल्यांतलें उदक पिवचें पडटा. आनी ह्या उदकाच्या बाटल्यांनी ह्या प्लास्टिकान आमची गटर्स, आमची जी ड्रेनेजीस आसा ती भरलेलीं आसता. हाचेर आमी कसो आळाबंद हाडूं येता.
In fact, I was mentioning, we have actually water tanker mafia in places like say Mumbai or Bangalore. As you correctly mentioned, there is enough rainfall. In fact, Goa gets a rainfall from 3,000 millimeters, that's 300 centimeters to 500 centimeters spread all over Goa. But the rainwater harvesting is something which we totally lack. In fact, in Goa University, one Chachadi, Dr. Chachadi had actually tried to do there are several areas, including our mining pits, which can be used actually for rainwater harvesting. So we can profitably use such areas, and maybe we should have more and more of wells, more and more of ponds, more and more of rainwater harvesting, and maybe in future societies, like in most of the other states, like say Kerala or Tamil Nadu or Karnataka, they actually put a small pipe from which all the water, at least because each of the societies has to be put actually from the PWD. But if most of the societies, in fact in Tamil Nadu, they use 3 or 4 different types of water. One water for drinking, and the water for clothing or washing, and the water for toilet, like that. In Goa, we use the same PWD water for each and everything. So that actually puts a pressure. So maybe, as you correctly mentioned, the rainwater harvesting is a very important component which each of the societies should do positively, and maybe a village can easily do it. And that will reduce the pressure on the water, and maybe, especially in cities, like say Panjim and other Madgaon or maybe Mapsa, etc.
टुरिस्ट इन्फ्लक्स जो गोंयांत आसा ताका लागूनय आमचे प्लास्टीक युसेज वाडटा. आतां कांय 5 स्टार हॉटेलांनी आपले ओन बॉटलिंग प्लांट सुरू केल्या आनी दे सप्लाय ग्लास बॉटलांनी उदक सप्लाय करता. बट ना जाल्यार प्लास्टीकच्यो उदकाच्यो बाटल्यो आमकां सारक्यो आतां कॉमन जाल्या. आतां ह्या प्लास्टीकच्या बाटल्यांचें आमी करप कितें?
I fully agree. In several places, they have actually tried to replace the plastic. Especially the plastic bottle has actually a real menace when you go to beaches, wherever you go. There are n number of plastic bottles, and some of the plastic bottles even go into the ocean. This puts pressure actually on the flora and fauna in the ocean, even for the fishes, etc. In fact, Goa is actually a place where most of the people come for a fish thali. So these things, whether it's microplastics or water, puts actually pressure on the ocean, and even most of the rivers. These things actually very dangerous. So I would say, maybe as you correctly mentioned, we should switch over to glass and maybe try to use less and less. Say for example, now you have given me a glass of water which is actually in a glass. So such things, maybe we should slowly shift back to the old mechanism of actually using glass bottles or maybe glass rather than actually plastic, and maybe so many things can be avoided, which it puts pressure on the environment, as you correctly mentioned.
पणजे आतां बुडपाक लागल्या, पणजे इल्ली सोंपपाक लागल्या, आनी तुमी म्हणटा तशें की दीस इज द इश्यू ऑफ एवरी कोस्टल सिटी. दर कोस्टल सिटी 20 वर्सां भितर कितें जातलें हें आमच्यांनी सांगूं नजो. असो डावट आसा की देर आर सर्टन सिटीज वीच आर एक्सपेक्टेड टू गो अंडर वॉटर. तुमकां कितें दिसता 20 वर्सां उपरांत पणजेची सिट्युएशन कितें आसतली?
No, it is not 20 years or 30 years or 40 years or 50 years. Basically, every year the sea level keeps on rising by about 2 or 3 millimeters in a year, so the sea level rises. But it's not the sea level rise alone. There are several other factors. In fact, one of my colleagues, Dr. Unnikishan, has actually worked on that, and another colleague has actually his PhD is on the sea level rise. But it is not that alone. It's actually how. There can be things like, say, for example, like Calcutta, there's a process called subsidence. So if the earth itself subsides and the water level rises, this can be actually this one. So if you say 2 or 3 millimeters in a year, it will need about, say, 40 or 50 years to have actually a meter or so. But this vulnerable area is actually very, very dangerous, either from the sea level point of view or from the disaster point of view, like say cyclones or tsunamis or whatever, or even the tidal areas, as you correctly mentioned. So this also puts a pressure. If there is a high tide along with actually the high amount of rainfall or intense rainfall event, or maybe a cloud burst, all these combined effect actually can have actually create a flood.
पणजेम आमकां बॅकवॉटर्स जी आसात,
Yeah.
मानसो जाका आमी म्हणटात, मानो सिस्टम ही आमची एक ट्रेडिशनल सिस्टम आशिल्ली, जातूंतल्यान वॉटर फ्लो जो आसा तो रेग्युलेट जातालो. तातूंतल्यान नुस्तें आमी मेळटालेच गोंयकारांक, बट एट द सेम टायम हुंवार येवचें ना वा नॅचरल डिझॅस्टराक लागून गांवचे गांव काबार, सॅलिनिटीक लागून गांव काबार जावचे ना, हाजी जतनाय त्या मानसांक लागून जाताली. ह्या मानसांचो जो रोल जो आसा, मानशी ज्यो आसात, तांचो रोल कितलो इम्पॉर्टंट पणजे सारकेल्या शारांत फ्लडींग थांबोवपाक?
Yeah, backwaters, as you correctly mentioned, are very, very important. In fact, especially for the recreation point of view, it's very important. You can do a boating, you can do a fishing and whatever. Such things are actually decreasing because of the human greed. Everybody will think of actually having a society over there, a flat over there, or this over there. So, as I said, we are encroaching more and more actually into the river basin or into the, let us say, the backwaters. So, it is actually, natural areas are actually shrinking. Either it's actually in terms of actually river basins or whatever. In fact, Mandovi River has the largest river basin. Even though river is small, Suwari River is much more longer. Mandovi is about 1,500 square kilometer of actually river basin. But if more and more people encroach into that areas, it becomes difficult. And especially for a city like Panjim, which is actually highly concentrated and so much of population and staying over there. So this puts actually pressure on the city as well as on the other things like.
सी ट्रेडिशनल आमचें जें विजडम आशिल्लें, दॅट टायम ओके, पॉप्युलेशनूय आमचें कमी आशिल्लें, इतलो अर्बनायझेशनाचो प्रेशर आमचेर नाशिल्लो. नाव वॉट एज हॅपन, पॉप्युलेशन आमचें वाडलां, ओके, अर्बनायझेशन वाडलां, लोकांचो वावर ज्या ज्या जाग्यार नाशिल्लो थंय वाडला, दोंगर कापप चल्ला, ताका लागूनय आमचे झाडां कमी जायत चल्ल्या. आनी दुसरे वटेन वी आर टॉकिंग अबावट ग्रीन बिल्डिंग्स, ग्रीन आर्किटेक्चर. हाऊ डू यू लूक एट this kind of dichotomy?
As you correctly mentioned, now as the population increases, one of the most important things what we need is actually energy. Say for example, most of us actually depend actually on the electricity from the national grid, and unfortunately we don't get actually, so most of them may be from power plants or whatever which is actually using coals. But if we switch on from there to, let us say, wind power or maybe solar power, that will reduce the pressure. For example, yesterday only I heard that actually the monsoon season actually in Japan has substantially decreased by about 22 days. So they don't have enough power, and the things will change and it puts pressure on the electricity. Same is the case with Goa. If the global warming or whatever, the air temperatures rises, it puts pressure on the electricity. And everybody will need actually a fan, AC and such things. And as you said, green buildings. In fact, there is a thing called building climatology topic. It was started long back actually in IIT Kharagpur. So if you have actually green buildings which uses lesser power, lesser energy, and maybe light, whether it's actually light which is coming actually from the various, as you correctly said, traditionally people had actually knowledge which place the kitchen should be or which place each of the rooms should be. So they had actually vastu, they used to call. So what you said is a very important aspect, especially from the light point of view and from the energy point of view. Let us hope, let us say the things, because nowadays the technology has changed so much within our own lifetime. So I would say the green buildings and green architecture will positively try to help in evolving into a better future for the human mankind.
We say the futuristic movies, तातूंत आमी पळयता की सिविलायझेशन सोंपलां आनी ह्युमन बिईंग्स जे आसात ते पृथ्वी वयल्यान तांचे लायफ सारकें काबार जायत चल्लां. तुमकां दिसता की फुडल्या 50 वर्सां भितर अशी परिस्थिती खरेंच ही आमी सायन्स फिक्शन मुवीज भितर पळयता ती आमचेर येवंक शकता?
I don't think it will happen like that. See, for example, men always adapt and change. See, for example, I would say India is one of the oldest civilization. People say 5,000 or whatever years actually. We have evolved, and actually only thing is actually we should adapt. We should adapt in a changing scenario or whatever. Say, for example, if the temperatures are rising. If you look at actually polar bear is actually living actually on sea ice in the Arctic Ocean. Same is actually the case actually about penguins which are in the Antarctic area. So they adapt and change. Same is the case with the fishes. If the sea surface temperature is warming, either the fish will migrate into the colder areas or maybe go into the deeper areas. Same way, the humans also adapted. In fact, most of the human beings were actually closest actually to the Indus, most of the rivers, whether it's Indus or whatever. So they will try to migrate into the region which are actually comfortable. So I don't think it will happen like that. Maybe, I am not saying that maybe people will need to migrate into maybe to Antarctica or maybe to colder areas where the temperatures are much more conducive rather than the hotter areas or warmer areas.
म्हणजे आमी पळयलां की इतिहासान टायग्रीस युफ्रेटीस जावं नायल जावं का इंडस जावं हांचे सिविलायझेशन्स कशी काबार जाल्या. आमी एका सुंदर शारा भितर रावतात जे मांडवीच्या देगेर परते एका न्हंयच्या देगेर आसा आनी आमी आशा दवरया की आमी एडॉप्ट जातले, आमी सुदारतले, आमचे सिवीक सेन्स वाडटले. फकत पॉलिटिशनाक ब्लेम करप, हाका ब्लेम करप, ताका ब्लेम करप हें सामकें सोंपें. पूण स्वता आमी ते कितले आचरणान हाडटा तें खूब इम्पॉर्टंट, तें खूब म्हत्वाचें. आनी हें आमी आचरणान जर हाडलें, एनवायरनमेंटाचे सांबाळ करपाचें, एनवायरनमेंट कसो वाचप, आमचे भोंवतणचें पर्यावरण कशें सांबाळप हें जर आमी चिंतलें जाल्यार पणजेचो हो फ्लडाचो जो इशू आसा, हुंवार येवपाचो इशू आसा आनी लोकांक त्रास जावपाचो इशू आसा तो खूब कमी जावंक शकता. रमेश बाब, तुमी हांगा आयले, आमचे कडेन चर्चा केली, तुमी खूब प्रश्नाचेर आमच्या खोलायेन आमकां जापो दिल्यो, खुबश्यो गोश्टीचेर बद्दल आमकां एनलायटन केलें. तुमकां दिनवास. आमी ही कार्यावळ हांगाच सोंपयतात, पूण तुमी खंयच वचूं नाकात, पळयत रावात. आमची नदर आसा फकत गोमंतक टीव्हीचेर.